in terms of getting back to Portugal, as you just mentioned, the first slaves, I think, that reached Portugal were in 1444, and about 35,000, followed between 1450 and 1500. And these slaves were taken to other places such as Spain, Italy, and Sicily. So those initial slaves went to Europe. And then, of course, the slave trade changed because of the need for labor in terms of the Western world, in terms of the Americas, in terms of the Caribbean, in terms of that whole agricultural demand for physical labor, and in terms of capitalist exploitation of resources. So can you take us through that now, as the Portuguese have started, and then I don't know who followed next, whether it was the Dutch and then the Spanish. Well, certainly I think the Spanish followed, and then the Dutch and the English, and we know it went down the coast from what was called the Slave Coast, which is basically, I think, Ghana, Nigeria, and Senegal, going all the way down, certainly Central Africa through Angola, and all the way down to the Cape. Can you fill us in there?
Yes, sir. The very first raid that starts mass enslavement, my knowledge says 1441, but I have seen that date disputed. And it was indeed the Portuguese, and they landed on the coast of Morocco, saw some Moroccan citizens and kidnapped them. And then that was the beginnings of it. And then more voyages. So you had a Portuguese mariner called Antam Gonçalves, and he's the person who's credited. And as you rightly say, the kidnapped people went back to Portugal, the other places in Europe, and also the islands off the coast of Africa, Canary, Madeira, all those kind of places. And in one of those places, there was a sugar thing happening. Does that make sense? So the association of enslaved people and sugar, that happened. But because Europe didn't know the Americas existed yet, that's why no one was sent west yet. Mm-hmm. Okay, so 1441. Now, Portugal is in total control of this part of mass enslavement. All right, as they get further down the coast of Africa, they land in places like Benin. Benin is strong and powerful, so the Portuguese can't really do much there. They get to Congo, but they were able in Congo the Congolese king was quite happy to be Christianized. But the Portuguese said, but to pay for this Christianization, people, we want people. Yeah. And that's how you ended up with people being pulled out of Congo and then places next door, Angola, those kinds of places. Now, there's a whole epic story of how the Congolese and the Angolans fought back to try and stop their people from being enslaved, the likes of Anne Nzinga, that kind of thing, the likes of King Garcia II. He wrote people that tried to stand up to slave trade. Then you had the Portuguese landing in Munumutapa. Munumutapa is the empire of Great Zimbabwe in southern Africa. And what the Portuguese did there was to enslave the people on the ground there, right? And they put that into action in 1628. So after 1628, the people there were enslaved on the ground.
Greetings, my name is Robin Walker. I'm also known as the Black History Man. I am perhaps best known for my 2006 book, When We Ruled. Based on this book, I'm launching a new online history course aimed at you, the adults. You could be a parent, you could be a teacher, a mechanic, cleaner, professionals, care workers, security guards, taxi drivers, kitchen workers, entrepreneurs, tech heads, lawyers, all of you. We want people from all over the world to be empowered by our content. We want you to gain mastery over your history and heritage. And you can do this by subscribing to our course. Click on the link to get this powerful, life-changing material.
All right, now that's the beginnings then of Spain, Portugal becoming a powerful country in the world. So Portugal became a world power. Portuguese people were everywhere and that kind of thing. Then the Spanish were able to get to the Americas and then come back and tell the whole of the European world, this place called the Americas existed. That was bad news for the Native Americans, who were now going to be genocided.
This was 1492, 1494.
Yeah. And then us as Africans, and that was bad news. So consequently, Spain now was able to control more and more of the Americas. They destroyed the Aztec Empire, which was ruling in Mexico. They conquered the satellite states in the Caribbean and so on and so forth. And they were basically able to take over the Americas. And they did it by genocide after genocide after genocide. And in my opinion, this was the most horrible period in world history. In other words, I don't regard the enslavement of Africans as the worst crime in history. I regard it as the second worst, because we're still here. Does that make sense? A lot of Native Americans, they're not here.
As adults and parents, how much do we really know about Black history beyond Malcolm X, Mary Seacole, the slave trade, and the man who invented the traffic lights? Greetings, I'm Robin Walker of The Black Secret, keen to get everybody up to speed with their history and heritage. I'm giving away a powerful free book called 100 Black History Facts. Click here to claim your free book.
Because their continent was going to be seized. North America, Central America, South America, the Caribbean, all of that was going to be seized. Yeah. And that's what the Spanish were doing. And then once the Spanish did that, it was, okay, now where are we going to get people from? And then they set up a contract called the Asiento. And what the contract did was to control, by monopoly, enslaved people in the Western world. And that meant then that people captured by the Portuguese ended up being sold to the Spanish in the Americas. And that's how you end up with a transfer of Africans to the Americas, which didn't happen before. Yeah.
Was that approved by the papacy at that time, or was that later?
Absolutely. The Pope blessed the slave trade from the very beginning. And again, that's some hard information because, of course, many of us today are Christians. And many of us today, it's painful to know that the religion that we follow, the person that was the head of it on this planet, blessed the slave trade from the word go. Not later, from the word go. We know that the Portuguese established an audience with the Pope somewhere around 1444. And the Pope is said to have blessed, no, wait a minute, to all those who shall be engaged in the said war, I offer complete forgiveness of your sins.
Yeah. So at least he knew it was a sin.
Yeah. This is quoted by Basil Davidson in his book. The book was originally called Black Mother, and then it was renamed The African Slave Trade. Yeah, it's in there. So what then happens is the Portuguese are capturing people, they're selling them on to the Spanish, and Black people are therefore ending up in the Western world. Then what happens is other countries get involved in the slave trade. So England gets involved in 1562 in the person of Sir John Hawkins. And what happens with Sir John Hawkins is he raided some Portuguese ships. So he didn't actually capture anybody himself. What he did was wait for the Portuguese to do a slave raid. and then ramrod their ships, and he seized Africans from those ships. But because the Spanish controlled the Asiento, those captured Africans ended up in Spanish hands. And then that's when European countries realized that it's not just about capturing people in Africa. You have to have your own lands in the Americas to sell them onto. Do you see? Yeah. And then that's why Britain then ended up seizing Virginia, seizing Jamaica, seizing Barbados, Bermuda, so that when they captured Africans, they could now send them to those islands that the British control. Well, it wasn't Britain then, it's England then. Does that make sense? You know, because England hadn't become Britain then, it was England.
Yeah.
France did the same thing. They seized Louisiana, they seized Martinique, they seized Guadeloupe. The Dutch did the same thing. The Dutch colonized South Africa, 1652. They colonized Brazil. Do you see?
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of the countries are they're all copying the same model that the Spanish and the Portuguese did, but tried to get around the Asiento. And then gradually all these countries are becoming part of the mass enslavement machine, and more Africans are being pulled out of Africa.
As a thank you for visiting our website, we are giving you a free copy of our exclusive 100 Black History Facts, which is in fact a taster of our course content. Make sure you leave your email address and we will send it right to you. We hope it inspires you to dig deeper into your history and heritage.
There things that I'd like you to investigate, to elaborate on, shall we say. Certainly, the Portuguese didn't just come and grab slaves. I mean, they had a superiority in terms of weapons, and clearly also the others. So when they landed and demanded slaves, they were at the same time destroying the countries in which they land in order to kidnap slaves. And I just want to read a little thing here. Sir Richard Burton, the British traveler, calculated that a slave raid to capture, 50 people, destroyed at least 10 villages, each with a population of around 100 to 200 souls. And then when you think of the fact that 15 or 20% of those slaves that were put on ships, died before they got to the other side. And then when you figure, I think somebody has calculated that maybe 15 million reached the Americas, North, South, Central. We're looking at, in excess of 60 million that were taken out of Africa. And those bodies were taken out. And of course, there were young men and women. There were intelligent young men and women, not just people with strong backs, because they would be the pride of the village, etc., etc. And the villages had to be destroyed, meaning that the nations were destroyed that the villages belonged to. So what we're seeing is a destruction of civilization in Africa, a removal of this human resource of enormous proportions. When you look at the total population of Africa at that time, I don't know, it may have been, 300 million? I don't know if you know those type of figures, but probably at least a quarter or more of the population of Africa was displaced because of the slave trade. And that's humongous in terms of African development. And we're not going to get into the change in terms of customs, because we'll do that when we get to colonialism. But this is just physical violence and terror and disruption of the civilizations at that point in time. Can you go deeper into that for us? How they were able to convince other Africans, shall we say, to sell their brothers and sisters or the next village into slavery?
Yeah, let me answer that. Mass enslavement began as kidnapping, but then it evolved into trade. And how it evolved into trade was, once you've got some Black people under your control because you've enslaved them, you can use those people to do raids on other groups of people, and they can't say no because they're enslaved. And then once you've got A raiding B, B now has to get arms to protect themselves from being raided. And then C needs to get arms to protect themselves just in case anything goes down. And then gradually you get this arms race. And then you'll get Europeans coming in to say, okay, you need arms. We can give you arms, but the deal is we want people. And so that results in what they call the enslaved people being sold for guns cycle. And that kind of thing ended up, so you ended up with African nations fighting each other, fighting each other, fighting each other. One side winning, one side losing, the other side winning, the other side losing. And meanwhile, people are disappearing. And then you get, in some situations, some ethnicities disappear entirely because the people are either dead or they flee. And the ones that flee end up joining other ethnicities. And what that means is a lot of people in Africa who think, well, I'm Yoruba. Chances are some of your ancestors are Yorubas. Some of them would have been people fleeing from elsewhere that ended up marrying in to your ethnic group. Do you see? So what happened is that was happening galore in Africa. Then you also have the de-civilization process that happens, where some people end up living in swamps, living in caves, living on hills, because that's the safest place to be, to make sure you're not slave raided. You also have this mentality of distrust of any new Africans coming into your area, because you don't know whether they are genuine refugees or whether they are agents sent there by European, or in some cases Arab enslavers to capture you. So you can't trust nobody. And this mentality of exclusivism and distrust is the beginnings of modern tribalism. So we can trace a lot of tribalism back to what happened during that period. Also, people living in swamps, people living on hills, people living in caves, you keep them separate enough for long enough, they end up speaking a different dialect to everybody else. And then this is how you end up with a multiplicity of languages and dialects. Do you see? And then, you know, there's a whole process of what happens, you know, once the people are de-civilized. You know that you've got different names, you know, baker, cook, that kind of thing, hunter. If the bakers end up on a ship, on a slave ship, that means that bread making in your area disappears. If the cooks end up on a slave ship, your cuisine disappears. If your tailors end up on a slave ship, your textiles disappear. And if these things disappear, you're going to have to buy them from somebody else. And if their trade route gets disrupted by slavery, you starve, you do without. And if you do without, that's the culture, that's your civilization declining. And that was going on all over Africa. I've even found out that Libya ended up a victim of transatlantic slavery. Some of their people ended up in the Americas, you know. You know, during the time when Colonel Gaddafi was ruling in Libya, I went on the Libyan government website, and there's a time period where they talk about their people ending up on ships that ended up transatlantic going to the Americas. Yeah.
Amazing, amazing. You know, you made a point there that I hadn't thought of before, and maybe we can just go back to that. Are you saying that, let's say before the slave trade, what you had were nations and empires?
Yeah.
And then because of the disruption of the slave trade, you end up with different groups amalgamating here, there, and everywhere. And this is, in some sense, the beginning of tribalism. or at least
Yes. Oh, yeah, yeah. Yeah, it's not my theory. Professor Chancellor James Williams, The Destruction of Black Civilization. That's what the whole book is about.
I've read that in the past, but I'm not sure I came away with that in terms of, in my conscious memory. Because that's of extreme interest, because as you know, tribalism is hampering the advance of Africa today.
Greetings, I'm Robin Walker of The Black Secret. Keen to popularize Pan-African heritage, we have 2 products that should interest you. We are giving away an introductory free book called 100 Black History Facts. Click here to claim your free book. Secondly, our online course, The Black Secret, has 55 hours of filmed content. You will systematically learn every major theme in our history, going all the way back. Click here for more information.
I mean, and we see it all the way from Ethiopia over to Nigeria. When, as you just talked about, the Yoruba, the Igbo, the Hausa, and the Fulani, and the country is divided up. So those are the main, tribal entities. But all of West Africa, you see it, and you see it in Congo, because that was encouraged, shall we say, by Leopold and the Belgians and the French, etc. So I think this is important for us to understand that tribalism is an outcome of the destruction of nation states and the kidnapping of our people. I mean, 20% or so of the African population, and this is an African population that in the prime of their youth, so that their contributions to civilization and development of their civilizations, were retarded over time, and this is something that we don't take cognizance of, in terms of saying, well, where's Africa? Why is Africa lagging in this and in that and in that? Certainly China has moved forward, India is moving forward, but Africa is still this kind of basket case. But it's not a basket case because of any intellectual problems. It's a basket case because of the invasions of Africa from the outside that have been so destructive. I think I'd like us to get back to this next time. Certainly, we need to explore a little deeper that whole business of African participation in the slave trade, because that's something that's thrown at us all the time by Europeans. That you sold your brother into slavery. I mean, we just bought them, but you're the one that sold them, which, as you know, is untrue. But we need to outline that deeper in terms of, if a guy is holding a gun to your head and he said, give me your wallet, he said, take the wallet, don't pull the trigger. And this was very much the situation that was going on there. And then I think we need to follow our brothers and sisters as they traveled across the Atlantic into the Western world and detail, shall we say, the horrors of our enslavement process. So that's where I think we need to go in our next few sessions. But this has been extremely enlightening, as usual. Thank you so much for your knowledge.
Thank you very much, sir.
Okay, Robin. Wonderful.